Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching The World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. Ukraine says it will begin high-level consultations with the United States in Switzerland on ending Russia's war. Security Chief Rustem Uramov says both sides will discuss possible parameters for a future peace deal. G20 leaders issue a declaration calling for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, the DRC, Sudan and the occupied Palestinian territories. The statement stresses the need for dialogue and humanitarian protections as global conflicts escalate. Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is moved from house arrest into police custody after a Supreme Court judge rules he is a high flight risk. The court says he violates monitoring terms and allegedly plans to break his tracking bracelet during a rally outside his Brasilia home. Brazil's COP30 summit has run into overtime after the EU blocked a draft agreement it said it wouldn't advance global emissions cuts. Negotiators worked through the night as the conference missed its Friday deadline. China accuses Japan of threatening armed intervention over Taiwan in a letter to the UN. The exchange marks a sharp escalation in a two-week dispute. Ukraine says 31 civilians jailed in Belarus have been released and returned home with sentences ranging from 2 to 11 years. Kyiv thanked the United States and President Trump for helping secure their return. Over 300 students and staff have been abducted from a school in Niger State in Nigeria. Security forces and local hunters are searching for the abducted. US officials and lawmakers are raising alarms over a Miami meeting where Trump envoys, including Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, held talks with sanctioned Russian Representative Kirill Dmitriev. Sources say the discussions focused on the draft Ukraine peace plan, prompting questions about contact with a blacklisted Moscow official. Those are the headlines for the hour, and we start this bulletin in Europe. And European and Western leaders have met on the sidelines of the G20 summit to discuss a response to US President Donald Trump's peace plan for Ukraine. The plan, which demands Ukraine accept key Russian terms, has been met with mixed reactions in Europe. While Trump's efforts to end the ongoing war were praised, many European leaders have found the terms in his proposal as unacceptable for Kyiv. Commenting on the plan, Polish President Karol Nawrocki has emphasized that any peace plan for Ukraine must be approved by Kyiv. This comes after the US signaled to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that his country should accept this US-drafted framework to end the war with Russia. The 28-point plan calls for Ukraine to surrender territory, accepts limits on its military, while also renouncing the ambitions to join NATO. Moreover, President Nawrocki emphasized that it was Ukraine and not Russia that was the victim of aggression. He has further stressed that peace cannot come at the expense of Russia achieving its strategic goals. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that the US plan could serve as a basis for peace, but Moscow may object to certain aspects of the draft, including the demand for its forces to withdraw from certain captured areas. Joining us now is Professor Veselin Popovsky. He is a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School in New Delhi. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Popovsky. We haven't spoken since this 28-point plan has been released. Tell me what you think of it. Of course, many critics are concerned that this plan echoes a lot of Moscow's sticking points. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, that's correct. It's really a Moscow plan, and that's why it's not going to work. It's controversial in itself. It starts by reaffirming Ukrainian sovereignty, but then it asks Ukraine to reduce its army, not to join NATO, to surrender territories. And half of those demands actually goes against the sovereignty of Ukraine. So it's a nonsense. Ukraine will not surrender its sovereignty. It will have support, and we see already, as you mentioned, Thomas, there is a lot of support from all European countries that met in G20 meeting in South Africa. And by the way, not only European countries. International law will not allow that to happen. Trump is thinking in a business transactional way. He thinks that this is between a seller and a buyer, and they can kind of adjust the price. Somebody may give up something. That's not a business transaction, and Donald Trump again and again fails to understand that at some point, but maybe next week he will come with something different. So I will think this plan is not going to work. We will forget about this next week, and there will be a new decision-making next week. There will be more meetings, and we understand that Zelensky will be in Switzerland meeting American officials. So there will be a lot of diplomacy going on, but still, the President Zelensky's willingness to talk with the Americans is something to welcome. The Europeans will also play a significant role in that. Everything that the Polish president said is absolutely correct. Zelensky said, we are happy to discuss, but it should be a dignified peace. And we don't see anything dignified in that proposal. And obviously Donald Trump, who changes his mind every day, if not every week. So I don't see a prospect for this to work at the moment. It will be kind of, they say a new peace plan, but that's actually a 19th century peace plan. At that time, the great powers were deciding the fate of the small countries, and it's definitely not what is going to work.
Yeah, and of course, and Professor, Donald Trump has obviously put a week-long deadline on this. Your thoughts on why is the US now reasserting pressure on Kyiv, given the previous statements made by Donald Trump as little as around a month ago, where Donald Trump even said that Ukraine could get all its territory back, and now it's saying that it should concede when it comes to Crimea and other territory, some territory which Russia hasn't even occupied yet. Yes, what were you
ridiculous, all of this. Again, Donald Trump is a hectic, erratic president. He wakes up with new ideas every day. And for that matter, sometimes he's changing his mind, and he thinks that pressuring Ukraine now will work. He gives yet another ultimatum by Thanksgiving next Thursday. Ukraine should accept that. Obviously, this is not going to work. Obviously, after a couple of conversations with the British and the French and the others, he will again change his mind. I wouldn't comment on Donald Trump because it's impossible. Donald Trump doesn't know what will happen tomorrow and what his talks will be tomorrow. So how can I comment on something that even Donald Trump doesn't know? And yes, because of that pressure, he wants to get something done. And he's definitely very irritated that, 10.5 months since his presidency, that conflict remains as serious. The other conflicts have been, we see progress everywhere else, but not in Russia, Ukraine, and that's what makes Donald Trump very angry.
But President Pavlovsky, of course this comes as Russia is reportedly advancing on the battlefield, gaining more and more territory. Is Donald Trump seemingly rewarding that aggression? We've seen countless an uptake in airstrikes on Kyiv as well. What are your thoughts on how he's acting?
Not really on the battlefield, Thomas. There are strikes on the big cities, and civilian casualties are reported almost daily, and that's very serious. But on the battlefield, not at all. I usually use the comparison with the snail, the slowest animal on the world. If that snail left Bryansk in February 2022, it would have been in Berlin already. So that's the speed of the Russian army. Snail will walk faster than the Russian soldiers. Absolutely no advance. They are claiming every day some territorial gains. But if we look longer term, for the last, let's say, 16 months, it's very minimal. It's several kilometers here, a couple of villages there. They are still outside Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, which they claim 6-7 times they already captured. And all those 6-7 times it happened not to be verified. Again, it's a joke how the Russian army is advancing, losing, by the way, a lot of soldiers during those attacks. And this is not going to work. And yes, the battlefield is frozen. There is not much movement either way. And that's why it's very interesting why J.D. Vance says we cannot supply Ukraine continuously with money and weapons because Ukraine will not win the war. But Russia is not winning anything also. And I think the Russian economy will collapse much faster than the European support for Ukraine. Again, that's not a calculation that J.D. Vance makes correct.
Yes. Professor Puchalski, do stay with us as we have further updates coming out of the east of the European continent. Ukraine has confirmed the return of 31 civilians who had been imprisoned in Belarus. These men and women were sentenced to terms ranging from 2 to 11 years. The return was coordinated by Kyiv's Prisoner Exchange Committee, which said the release was part of efforts to bring Ukrainians home safely. Ukraine expressed special gratitude to the United States and President Donald Trump, hailing their role in facilitating the release of both civilians and military personnel from Belarus and Russia, marking a significant diplomatic achievement. Professor Popovsky, what's your analysis on the new diplomatic ties between Belarus and the United States?
Congratulate on this one the American diplomats, the ambassador in Minsk, and everybody else who negotiated with Belarus the release of those prisoners. Obviously, these are innocent people, as you said. They should go home, should have been done already. Belarus has no point to detain and to keep them for so long. So finally, with pressure from the United States, as you said, Belarus released those prisoners. They will go home, reunite with their families. Obviously, a very good news. So yes, that suggests exactly that American diplomacy has potential to achieve a lot. And obviously, a lot of civil officers, civil service, diplomats are doing the right thing. And we should praise them for that. Well, the problem is still, as I mentioned earlier, on the top, when the president is erratic and doesn't know what to do tomorrow. That's where the problem comes. But the second rank officials are pretty much competent people, and they deliver, as we see in that excellent deal with Belarus to return the prisoners back home.
Yes, Professor Popovsky, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. We now move on, and China has called for strict international oversight of Japan's nuclear activities, citing concerns over the country's plutonium stockpiles and its potential to develop weapons-grade material. The warning has come from Li Song, China's permanent representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency, during a Board of Governors meeting. Let's take a listen in.
储存远超民用核能实际需求的固材料，是不扩散核武器条约成员国中唯一掌握后处理技术、有能力提取武器库，而且现在还有。
Highlighting Japan's nuclear capabilities, Li has stated that it is the only non-nuclear weapon state with reprocessing technology capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium and operating reprocessing facilities. Lee has urged Japan to address these nuclear safety concerns and to adhere to its commitments to peaceful development, emphasizing that the international community would not allow any move towards nuclear armament. Joining us now is Ross Feingold. He is a political analyst and he joins us live from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, thank you for joining us. China's IAEA representative is calling for strict oversight in what it calls Japan's nuclear threats. Is this a genuine safety concern or a geopolitical pressure with the backdrop of those tensions, of course?
I don't think anyone around the world thinks there's a serious security risk from Japan's nuclear capabilities, which includes the civilian nuclear power plants or its reprocessing capability. Obviously, this is an outgrowth of the ongoing tensions between China and Japan over the Prime Minister's statements about Taiwan recently. So China has implemented direct bilateral measures to show its displeasure, such as banning the import of Japanese seafood or discouraging Chinese people from visiting Japan for tourism or studies. And now they're taking it to international organizations as well. There was a post on social media by China's ambassador to the United Nations with some very strong statements. And now we see in another multilateral forum with regard to nuclear, China is also raising issues with regard to Japan. I think the international community knows what this is about. Nothing really is going to come out of this. But the interesting thing here, again, is that China is taking its approach beyond just the bilateral and even into international organizations.
And Ross, you briefly mentioned you think nothing's going to come out of this per se. You don't see this escalating whatsoever in regards to this 2-week spat that's been occurring between Beijing and Tokyo?
Oh, I do think that this spat is going to escalate, but with regard to international nuclear regulators taking any action, because what China is saying, again, I don't think there's any legitimate concern about what Japan is doing with its nuclear capabilities at the moment. I mean, there's certainly no evidence that Japan is trying to research nuclear or develop nuclear weapons, although to be frank, everybody knows that Japan has that capability if they wanted to pursue it. They certainly have the talent. They could create the infrastructure to do so if they really wanted to do that. But again, as far as going to international nuclear regulators and saying, do more about Japan, I think the reaction from the member countries as well as the international organizations is going to be there's no issue here.
And Ross, of course, you've said this situation has the possibility to escalate. Of course, this started when Senator Kyiv made comments about seeing an attack on Taiwan by China as a threat to its own security. What is the feeling in Taiwan right now about this situation?
Certainly the government here in Taiwan has shown its support for Japan, both in statements and action. We have a large number of political leaders, starting with the president, William Lai, posting photos of themselves eating Japanese seafood in the wake of China's ban on the import of Japanese seafood, encouraging Taiwan people to travel to Japan for tourism. So certainly there's a large segment of the political class as well as the public that wants to show its gratitude and its solidarity with Japan. There are critics as well. I mean, there are critics who say, well, Japan is really the one stirring up the trouble. I would say that that's still the minority view at the moment, and the majority here in Taiwan is generally happy and or grateful for the supportive words from Japan. But that might change over time. If this incident, the spat continues, tensions continue to rise, there could be people in Taiwan who start to question whether this was necessary.
Yes, Ross, stay with us as we move over to South America next up. COP30 President Andre Correa do Lago has announced that road maps on fossil fuels and forests will be further presented, and as no consensus has been reached on these issues at COP30. Sources earlier confirmed that a deal has been reached on a side text covering fossil fuels, but the main issues remain unresolved. The closing plenaries of the summit are, however, scheduled to begin very soon. Now, the outcome of Brazil's COP30 climate summit remains seemingly uncertain, with the European Union rejecting a draft deal that it claims would fail to advance global efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, emerging economies have pushed back against the EU's position, urging the European bloc to commit more financial support to help developing countries combat climate change. We're now once again joined by Ross Feingold. Ross, COP30, governments have reached an agreement on a side text here covering fossil fuels. How meaning is this breakthrough in the broader terms?
Unfortunately, it's not. And that's one of the problems of the COP framework over recent meetings. And the absence of the United States certainly has an effect as well. Obviously, President Trump's administration is skeptical of climate change and not supportive of international agreements in this regard. Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement again. So a side agreement, is that really enforceable? Is it really going to change the situation? The answer, frankly, is probably not. And that's why it's called a side agreement rather than having a more substantive name like an international agreement or something enforceable. So unfortunately for the countries that genuinely wanted to see substantive achievement, and I'm speaking from Taiwan, where we're in the Pacific Ocean, and those Pacific Island countries, those small island states in the Pacific, they're the ones who are most affected by climate change. They're very concerned. Frankly, they're very angry. But a side letter or issues are still unresolved. It just shows that the COP process at the moment, unfortunately, like many multilateral organizations, it's become a failure.
Yeah, and Ross, of course, the COP30 deadline has been extended into today. It was supposed to end on Friday. Your thoughts on this summit as a whole?
Again, the absence of the United States in a U.S. administration that doesn't really support the goals of the COP process, that's not helpful to reaching substantive agreements to reduce emissions. So the reality is, going forward, I don't think we're going to see much change. Some of the largest emitters are probably going to continue doing what they've been doing. And again, there are going to be countries around the world that are going to be extremely frustrated with this result. But adding 2 more days just means that a bunch of diplomats and experts get to spend 2 more days on the taxpayer dime, whining and dining and talking. But it's not really going to reach a substantive agreement that's really going to have an effect on emissions.
Yeah, and Ross, of course, you join us from Taiwan. Asian economies heavily reliant on coal, China, India and Indonesia. Does this agreement push them towards a faster decarbonisation, or will they just treat it as advisory?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To be fair to countries in this part of the world, a lot of them have made a significant effort to increase the share of renewables in their energy mix. Here in Taiwan, although they discontinued the use of nuclear, which I think was a mistake, but they have increased their use of solar and wind, and we do see that in other countries around Asia as well. But in some of the Asian countries that are growing rapidly, whether India or Indonesia, and China's economic growth is still high, even though it's not as high as it used to be, they still need the dirty energy in addition to their investment and their growing use of renewables. And they take the attitude in many cases that, well, if the United States and Europe and Australia are not really doing too much, why should we?
Yes, Ross Feingold, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. Always a pleasure. We now move on, and Pope Leo has accepted the resignation of Bishop Rafael Zornoza of Spain's Diocese of Cadiz y Ceuta. Zornoza, who's 76 years old, who has led the diocese since 2011, is under investigation for over an alleged sexual abuse of a teenage boy in the 1990s, which he denies. The Vatican did not reference the allegation in its statement, however. Zornoza is the first publicly known Spanish bishop to be investigated by the Vatican over abuse claims, and the case is being examined by a church tribunal at the Vatican's embassy in Madrid. Pope Leo has met with groups of abuse survivors in the past month. The resignation comes amid ongoing global scrutiny of the Catholic Church, which has faced decades of abuse scandals and costly settlements. Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.